And so you see, the true war was within us all along. I had a burger and mac and cheese for lunch. It's an absolute battlefield in there. What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Sounds Good Makes Sense, a discussion show for the World of Warcraft player. My name is Devilor, and today, especially with the upcoming launch of The War Within, I want to spend some time talking about early access. Now, just to start us off and to make sure we're very clear about everything here, the term early access nowadays can actually mean two different, and I consider them very separate things inside the gaming industry. The first thing that it can mean is what's happening with The War Within, and has been becoming increasingly common among AAA game releases, and alarmingly so among MMOs as well, which is just the general concept of the game is already complete. It's already out. It already can be played. Like, the game is done. And what you're doing is you are purchasing something that allows you to get like a head start on everyone else. You're allowed to get access to this game a few days before what is considered the official release. And this is usually something that like AAA studios, like I was saying, they'll usually end up doing as like either a way to try to drive additional pre-purchases of their game that's coming out, or like trying to sell a higher edition or a more expensive edition of the game, like what Blizzard is doing with The War Within. But I want to make sure we draw a clear distinction between that type of early access, just as we're talking about this throughout this show. I want to draw a clear distinction between that type of early access and the more like pre-alpha, buy this game to help support us making it approach to early access. And that has some of its own issues as well. There's definitely been cases of early access games that just kind of never like just turned out to be kind of a mess. Atlas. There's been cases of situations where there are games that went into early access and then just kind of fell apart afterwards. That's a whole separate topic that we'll probably go into in another video here on the series at some point. But I want to make sure it's clear that there's a difference between the War Within style of early access, which is what we'll be talking about today, and the more like Hades, Ark, Baldur's Gate 3, that style of early access where it's, hey, we're still working on the game. It's not done yet, but if you give us some money so that we ostensibly can use that to help continue creating the game, then you get early access to whatever we've got available right now. Got it? Okay, cool. So let's start off the discussion about the War Within's early access by actually just describing what is in the War Within early access. How is this working and what's going on with it? How is it all coming together? So that way we have that sort of standpoint to begin from for the discussion. So if you're not already aware somehow or other, obviously, this is pretty widely known at this point, but there's 3 different versions of the World of Warcraft, the War Within expansion that are available for purchase. There's the base edition, the heroic edition, and the epic edition. And those 3 editions have some different like unlocks and different things that you get with them. Base edition, you just get the game and a character boost. They are including the character boost again for the base edition. The heroic edition, you get all of that, a little bit more trader's tender, and you get a mount and a transmog set. And then the epic edition, you get all the stuff in the heroic edition. You also get you got beta access to the War Within with the epic edition. You get the early access that we're talking about, and then you get a few other things like there's a pet, there's a toy, there's a Hearthstone effect, and there's 30 days of game time. And I'm going to take a quick aside here before we get back to the direct topic of the early access, just to kind of rant a little bit about how these different editions are put together. Because like I just said, the epic edition comes with 30 days of game time, which by itself, at least in the US market, is priced at $15. So that's a $90 Epic Edition, which is $20 more than the $70 Heroic Edition. But one of the things in it would have cost you $15. So basically, if you get the Heroic Edition, you ostensibly are also going to need to have access to the game to be able to pay it. So the Heroic Edition effectively costs you, like math, $85 to be able to actually play it. Now, obviously, there's people who will purchase their game time with gold through the WoW token. There are people who have their game time still active for like a couple of weeks, and they're like, I'll just buy the expansion and I'll decide later if I actually want to keep playing it. But to me, I don't know, it just seems weird that the Heroic Edition is priced in such a way where it is effectively only $5 less than the Epic Edition. To me, it's just kind of weird. I feel like the game time should also be included in the Heroic Edition. I just think that would make sense. And honestly, like at that point, then there's the question of like, okay, now the base edition is only $5 less effectively than the heroic edition. I don't know. The addition of the game time in there makes the pricing on all of these very weird. It has been that way for a long time, by the way. Like this isn't something new to the War Within. It's been that way for God, at least since Shadowlands, I think, probably possibly even earlier. It's always been a thing for the last couple of expansions. It's just something that I find weird and awkward, and I don't know. I don't like it. I don't know why that really sticks out to me so much. It just seems like, why would you ever buy the heroic edition and miss out on all the extra stuff that you get with the epic edition, unless like literally the difference of $5 is what it comes down to. I don't know. It just seems weird to me. But anyway, that whole rant aside, which honestly is kind of more of a pet peeve than anything else for me. It just bothers me. Anyway, that whole rant aside, let's get back to talking about the War Within's early access. So one immediate thing that sticks out to me about this whole thing is that so if you have the Epic Edition of the game, you get what they have advertised as a 3-day early access. But what's weird is that they have separately announced that the War Within, like when they announced that the War Within release date was the 26th, they also announced that early access would begin on the 22nd, which is 4 days. It's not 3 days, it's 4 days. I don't understand what that means. Like maybe they're just assuming it's late in the day. Maybe they want to err on the side of accidentally giving people more time than giving people less time. I'm not sure what that actually is, but it means that August 22nd, which is a Thursday, they will be giving people early access to the War Within full release, essentially. You will have full access to the game as it exists at that point in the life cycle of the expansion. Now, there are some restrictions in place, and most of them are not technically early access restrictions. I think this is an important distinction to point out, because a lot of people have been saying like, oh yeah, during early access, you won't be able to do all of this stuff. There are many of the things that you can't do during early access, you will also not be able to do come the full release on Monday. That includes basically anything that requires a weekly reset is going to be disabled based on what Blizzard's been saying, is going to be disabled until that first weekly reset. So things like profession cooldowns will not be accessible. Things like the weekly world quest stuff will not be accessible. In fact, it's been kind of confusing to try to find out if world quests are even accessible or not during the pre-season 1 period whatsoever. I'm assuming there will be some stuff to do and it'll just be bumped up later on, but I don't know. There's been some confusing and conflicting details about that from what I was able to dig up. But for the most part, it's similar to how it's been at the launch of the last couple of expansions, where they've basically, ever since they've started doing the global release thing, they have also had that restriction in place where anything that requires a weekly lockout doesn't actually activate until that first weekly lockout hits, which is only a matter of hours after release, typically about half a day between the US full release. And it's actually less than half a day. It's like, I can't do the math on top of my head, like 10 hours, I think, something like that. There's that brief period of time. This is just extending that period of time for people who purchase the early access to a few days prior to that. So it's the same as it is for previous expansions, where you just are not able to do things like, well, historically Mythic Zero, we'll get into that in a second. But you're not able to do things like try to get your Great Vault stuff going. You're not able to do your weekly world quests and stuff like that. You're not able to use your weekly profession cooldowns. That stuff will all be disabled. I'm just wanting to make sure it's clear and understood that that is just a normal restriction for prior to that first weekly reset anyway. That's not specifically an early access restriction. There's just a kind of a fine detail there. I don't know how much it really matters. Just seemed like something to point out. But there are a couple of interesting exceptions to that. There are a couple of things I noticed when digging through all of the material that Blizzard has put out talking about this that make it a little bit different. So one big exception is that heroic dungeons actually unlock with the global release. So that is something that's not accessible to early access, but will be accessible to people in that period of time between the global release and that first weekly reset. Heroic dungeons will become available. So if you do get yourself to max level in the time span between the early access launch and the global release on Monday, then you will be able to immediately go into heroic dungeons and start getting whatever loot you want from those much faster than anyone else will be able to. How much it actually matters is debatable for reasons we'll get into in a second, but that is something that I noticed was interesting. What stuck out to me even more than that, however, is they did call out specifically in their blog that the Season 4 PvE rewards would still be accessible until, again, that global release of World of Warcraft: The War Within, which theoretically, I I haven't been playing Dragonflight, so there could be something I'm not thinking of here that's just not sticking out to me properly. But it does theoretically mean that you could be getting like some of the Keystone achievements or something at the next level cap. By like, you could go into early access, level up, and then go back and get those previous season Mythic Plus achievements. There may be some sort of level lock in place for it. There may be something that means like you actually can't do that. I'm not sure. But that is something that stuck out to me as interesting. And if you know the answer, please do leave a comment. I would actually love to know if that's something where, hey, actually a whole bunch of people are about to get Keystone Master because they just did it at a higher level and much quicker than they otherwise would have been able to. But other than those couple of weirdnesses, like I've been saying, it sounds like most weekly lockout options. So things like profession cooldowns. Ian had also mentioned like the best drops from rares. So like if there's a rare that has a weekly like drop timer on it or something like that, that those items won't be available to you until the first weekly reset. Things like World Quest weeklies. There's a lot of this stuff that will not be accessible to anyone, whether they have early access or not, until that first, in the Americas, it's Tuesday, weekly reset occurs. Now, there's one other important distinction that's been made for the War Within, which is that they've actually moved the Mythic Zero unlocks to the first week of Season 1. So that's going to be 2 weeks into the expansion. You won't be able to access those Mythic Zeros and do the weekly lockout stuff until the expansion has been out for 2 weeks already. And thus there will be a lot of other like World Quest loot will likely go up at the same time. There will be a bunch of other things that occur alongside the Season 1 launch that kind of does end up having the ultimate effect of making the early access time frame really just like, okay, you got in a couple days more and you got to wait faster. And since the Season 1 release isn't for 2 weeks after the expansion release, I'm actually kind of looking at that and wondering like, why do I actually want the early access then? Like, what is the advantage here? I get to do nothing sooner. Hooray. But we're going to get into advantages and disadvantages in a second. I got a whole list that I have to go through here in a minute. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. It does ultimately, though, mean that it kind of sounds like, yeah, there isn't really that much in the way of an advantage for anyone from this early access. It's literally just you get to get in a little bit sooner, and then you get to the same like endpoint where everyone else will be after what, a couple of days of playtime. Everyone else will be there just as quickly, and you all get to stand around and wait, maybe level some other characters, get your alts up, do warband stuff, whatever it is you want to do there. You can do all of that for those first couple of weeks, but it kind of sounds like there won't be much else going on during that time period, which ultimately means that the early access might not actually mean much. One quick aside before I continue, I actually do not know when delves open up. I saw some people talking about how they don't open until Season 0 or Season 1 actually starts, but I couldn't find any confirmation of that. So again, if anyone knows exactly when delves unlock, leave a comment below. Let me know. I would very much like to have that information. But anyway, we're kind of in this point where I feel like a lot of people, and this is very common in the gaming industry and very common in discussion and communities that surround games these days, where people kind of look at something and say, hey, yeah, it's not actually that bad. It's kind of not whatever. And that's great and all. Like, it's not maybe necessarily a overall bad thing for the game that this exists here, but I think it's important to then continue on from there and ask the question, okay, if it's not bad, that's fine. If it's just kind of whatever, sure. But is it good though? Like, is having this early access thing and having this as a purchasable extra thing that some people will have access to and some people won't as a result, is this actually an improvement to the video game? Is this the sort of feature that makes the game better? Even if it's just for the people that purchased that early access, but in general, is this something that we should be happy exists inside of World of Warcraft? Is this something that we should look at and say, great, so glad that they added early access? Again, obviously for the people who are purchasing it, but then also for the people who are not purchasing it. Is this something that will improve their experience in the game in any way or not? I think these are important questions to ask. So I've listed out some what I consider possible negatives to having the early access added to the War Within, and also some potential positives as well. And I phrase that like that because to me, one of the negatives is actually a really big deal. And that is the fact that this is likely to split up friend groups. This is like World of Warcraft is still, even with all of the like modernization that's happened to the game over the years, still with all the like random queuing and all the cross realm and everything else that's been going on, it's still ostensibly a social video game. It is an MMORPG, and it still clings to that mindset, which means that Blizzard ultimately can and should be hoping that you are finding friends to play with, and that you are finding your group, you're finding your guild, you're finding your community, etc. inside of World of Warcraft, and thus having friends to play the game with so you can experience it together. If 3 of your 5 friends all got the game 4 days before you did, you kind of can't do that. Like, even if they say, okay, cool, I'm going to level a character, but it's like an alt, and then I'll come back and level my main character with you guys, you're not experiencing it together for the first time. This is something that always, like, I always had to be very careful about way back in the day when I was still doing like I would regularly be invited to betas for things like the Burning Crusade, Wrath of Lich King, etc. I've been in every World of Warcraft beta that's ever existed. I'll put it that way. And I would have a lot of friends who are like, we know that you've played the beta. Please do not come with us to this dungeon. Or if you do, just be quiet the whole time, because we want to be able to figure this out and experience this ourselves. This was back in the days when people weren't looking everything up ahead of time, and like still there are lots of people who try to not look all this stuff up ahead of time because they want to experience it directly for the first time themselves. And if you've got someone in the group that has already done everything, like, that's still, like, even if they are just quiet the whole time, that kind of messes with the dynamic. You want to be able to include them in figuring out what's going on. You don't want, like, my friend to be here but shut up the whole time. That sucks. There really isn't a good way to take a situation in which, like I said, 3 of your 5 friends that you were all going to level together with, but you didn't get early access and they did, or you did get early access and they didn't. There really isn't a way to meld that together in any way that doesn't, in my opinion, dampen the experience or damage the experience somewhat. Like, at the very least, I cannot think of a way to reconcile those 2 issues where you would say, all right, you can still experience your group of friends all leveling together, or your guild mates, or like, it doesn't have to be like this is your social club sort of thing. It's just fun to be leveling and finding things that are new at the same time as everyone else. This is something we've definitely learned from playing Season of Discovery, that Season of Discovery has been at its best when the whole community is discovering things at the same time. Even if you're playing by yourself, you come across someone and you see that they're doing something, you go, oh, you can talk to them about it, and they're figuring it out together. It's not the sort of, you don't get that experience when someone else has already done everything. And especially in World of Warcraft, where there's such a trend of like, haven't you ever even done this before in literally everything that you do, where you're just expected to, with no, like, every player is expected to, with no communication, understand everything about every dungeon in World of Warcraft just innately. That's just where the community has gotten these days. That's a problem to me. Other things that I put in the possible negatives list. This does kind of suck for people who still like to hang on to like realm first leveling and stuff like that. Now, realm doesn't mean that much in the modern game these days. World first even doesn't really mean, when it comes to leveling, world first doesn't really even mean that much in the modern game these days, because it usually takes like a couple of hours for somebody to get there. But it does mean that if you want to be pushing for, like, of your group of friends, you were the first one to level, or of your group of friends, you were the first one to max, or of your server or your guild or whatever, you were the first one to max this profession, you were first to do anything, essentially. It does kind of mean that now you got to pony up the extra $50 to be able to do that. And that kind of sucks. Excuse me, that's extra $40, not $50. Want to make sure I'm correct there. Another potential negative for this is, like, this could go really bad if they hit any major snags. Like, back in the days of, like, I have flashbacks still, because this was the first expansion launch that I worked at Blizzard for. I still have flashbacks of what happened during the Warlords of Draenor launch, where the entire horde on every server everywhere was stuck behind like the second quest of the expansion. That was a bad time. If people have paid extra to have early access to the expansion and something bad like that happens, that would be very, very bad. And that's why this is in the potential negatives column, not an actual negative, because obviously it's very likely that nothing like that happens. Like, there really haven't been issues like that in a long time. In fact, Warlords is probably the last time that it actually occurred, now that I think of it, because then Legion came out. Legion was super smooth. I think there were a couple of bumps and bruises with BFA, but then Shadowlands and Dragonflight were both pretty smooth as well, from what I can recall. At the very least, I don't have any trauma from any of those launches, whereas I definitely did from Warlords of Draenor. So That's the sort of thing that sticks out to me as probably not a problem, but it is potentially something that I'm sure Blizzard is keeping in mind. And honestly, probably why they ended up going with 4 days instead of 3, so that they aren't launching on a Friday. This way, they're at least launching it on a Thursday. And if anything goes wrong in the first few hours, they can fix it and not have cut into anyone's 3 extra days just for legal reasons. That's the sort of thing that's important. That's probably what's going on there. I don't expect that to be a thing, but it is the sort of thing that I did want to list here, because it's a discussion show and it's worth considering all angles. There is also a possible major impact. And I say possible because it's not something I know very innately myself, but there is possibly a major impact to professions here that I think is worth mentioning. Now, I'm not big into professions. I just really don't like the way WoW does professions, like full stop. It's really never been something that I've liked in the game, but it is what it is. I know a lot of people are very involved in professions and really do enjoy that gameplay. And I know that the first few days of every expansion is a huge and important time for people who are leveling professions, because this is the period, especially for gathering professions, this is the period where you can get one herb and sell it for insane amounts of gold, because the people who have been using their professions to amass this huge amount of gold are the ones who are now also able to, they're able to afford that, and they will go out and they'll buy that. And I know a lot of people will make sure that they go out and gather a whole bunch right away so that they can make a ton of gold that then lasts them most of the expansion as a result. With things like the WoW token in play, this is something that people will utilize to be able to actually purchase their subscription, and they will be able to utilize these early few days of the expansion to like make the fact that they're even playing the game continue to function. And that's much more difficult to do when you don't have access to the game. And those first few days, like, it's very likely that one big advantage that comes through for people who are invested in, or people who do have the early access, is just that they are able to earn all of that gold in those first few days. Like 4 days is a long time. So if people are going through and they're gathering all of these resources and everything, and they're able to sell them on the auction house to people who then can level their professions, that could be a big thing that really affects the way that trade skills and professions work, and really affects the way that the experience goes for people who are heavily invested in those things. And one other important thing to note about this specifically is that there is a higher than average number of players who are invested in professions who utilize the WoW token. That's not something that I know is an exact fact. It's just something that I would assume, because these are the people who make tons of gold. And if you're making tons of gold, why not use some of that to pay for your subscription? Which in turn means that there are people who are probably less likely to be buying the Epic Edition as a result, because things like the extra game time to them doesn't matter as much. I don't know. There's some thoughts there. Again, I'm not super invested in professions, so I can't speak to the actual depth of the impact, but I do know that some people have mentioned it to me as like, yeah, this really screws over professions, and I don't have any reason to believe that they're wrong. Now, the last potential negative that I want to mention before we move on to some of the potential positives for having early access in the game is the notion that, oh, this is just Blizzard being greedy, and this is just Blizzard trying to claw as much money out of us as possible. They just want us to spend more money, and that's all they're after here. So they just really want to get more money out of us. And I see that perspective, but I disagree with it as a problem, because they sell video games. That's what Blizzard does. The purpose of the company is to make video games in the hopes that you will spend money on them. So obviously they're going to do things that they hope will get you to spend more money on the video game. And like, that's just how those companies work. I don't know. Maybe it's because I spent so long working there and I've seen how all that comes together, that to me, that's just like, well, yes, obviously. Like, to me, this doesn't register as a negative. This just registers as expected behavior. It's a company. Their product is the video game. They want to make money. So therefore they're going to try to do things to get you to spend money. The whole purpose. And there's this whole side topic that I will almost certainly get into in some video at some point, talking about this. There's this weird notion among the overall gaming community where people just sort of expect everyone who makes video games to do it because they love video games and want to make good video games for people. And that's always a motivating factor for people who make video games, because believe me, there are much more lucrative industries to get into with the exact skill set that making video games requires. If you're not passionate about making video games, like, you could go be a software engineer somewhere and make 2 to 4 times as much working in the tech industry than you do working in the gaming industry. And there are a billion of those jobs available. Even post layoff session, those jobs are available. If you're working in video games and you're focusing your career on video games, it is inherently because you want to be working on video games. That is always the case for everyone in the gaming industry. Because again, if you're only after money, there are so many better ways to use that same set of skills to make money. But at the end of the day, the people still need to understand, like, they do actually have to make money. Like, it's the world. There's an economy. There are bills to be paid and so on. When people expect that, oh, they're just doing it to make money, my response to that is typically like, well, yes, obviously. But anyway, that's another whole side rant, and I'm being extra rambly today. So we're going to move on. I will note that I did mention earlier that I had an issue with the way that the editions are put together, but that's more because of the game time thing. That just feels weird to me. I don't mind as much that the early access is tied. I have issues with the early access in general, which we already talked about. Excuse me. I don't mind as much that it's tied to the Epic Edition, because again, I expect companies like Blizzard to want to make money. So to me, that's just the way it exists. That's just how it is. That's not a, oh, how dare you, Blizzard sort of thing. That's just literally like, yes, obviously they're attempting to make money. Anyway, moving on from that, let's talk about some of the potential positives by having the early access period in the game. And I want to look at these from both the perspective of the person purchasing it. Does it make their experience better by having purchased the early access? But also the game as a whole and the experience as a whole. Is it better for people who haven't purchased the early access that it was available and other people purchased it? And the big one that sticks out in my mind for fulfilling potentially both of those criteria is the potential that the overall launch will be smoother by splitting up the population, by saying, okay, a bunch of people bought the early access. They're going to go through first. They're going to run into all the bugs and issues right away. We're going to see where the bottlenecks are. We're going to see where, like, this quest mob isn't spawning often enough. This NPC over here takes too long to stand there and talk and then isn't accessible that whole time. They're going to find all of those during the early access period, and thus have all of those fixed by the time the global release comes out, so that theoretically the people who are playing at the global release will thus have a smoother experience by virtue of the fact of these other players essentially beta testing, going through all of this. Now, the caveat I'll throw on top of that is that, like I was saying earlier, there really hasn't been a ton in the way of those issues over the last several expansion launches. So I think we can kind of start from the expectation that those wouldn't really be a big problem anyway, but they are always something that could potentially occur. We won't know until after the actual expansion releases and we see it for ourselves. But there is always the potential that some things can be fixed by the time that the global population, the global release comes out and the majority of the population are able to get into the game. Always a possibility that it ends up being a slightly smoother overall launch as a result. Plus, there's just benefits to having some of the player base moving at a different pace and at a different time than the rest of the player base. You could also make the argument, as a second point that is potentially in the positives column, you could also make the argument that most players will feel less rushed and in less of a hurry to try to hit max level if it's already been done and someone else has done it ages ago. Like most of the, obviously not the early access players, they're still going to want to try and rush at least as much as they would have otherwise during the early access release. But the average player who just bought up the basic edition, they're just coming in on Monday, they're not going to feel any pressure at all to try and rush themselves to max, to try to rush themselves to clearing out things just to have done it first. That said, they may also feel that pressure to try and catch up because now they feel like they're behind. So this is one that I say you could make the argument. I genuinely don't know that I would, but you could make this argument. I could kind of go either way on it. It might improve things for some people. It might genuinely make things worse. Like there's aspects of this that should probably have been in the potential negatives column, where you just end up feeling like, oh, I'm behind everyone else, and now I have to rush to catch up so that I can do these heroic dungeons that just unlocked today. In fact, actually, you know what? I'm changing my mind. We're putting this one back in the negative column. We're putting this one in the negative column entirely, because I do feel like a lot of people, especially those who have friends or guilds that they're playing with, who did not get the early access, but their friends and guilds that had people who did. The fact that the heroic dungeons come out the same day means that those people that got the early access are going to want people to do heroic dungeons with. and thus they're going to be encouraging, and even if that not directly, the person who just came in on that day is going to feel some pressure, some amount of social need to try and catch up to their friends as quickly as possible, so that they then have the ability to go into and help them out in the heroic dungeons. So that's another one. I kind of changed my mind mid-sentence and mid-thought in this whole thing, but I think we're lumping this one fully back into the negatives as well, which is a little awkward because the last one that I would put under the potential positives column is also kind of a negative in a way. And it is. I'm going to just be straight out of the gate. There is some hefty copium going on with this one. Just so you're aware that I'm aware of the amount of copium it takes to say these sentences. This is pretty far from the worst thing Blizzard could have done to make some extra money. Now, I don't want to have this come across as like heavy criticism of Blizzard or anything. I spent a whole bunch of time earlier talking about, like, obviously they need to make money, and so they're going to come up with ways to make money. And as a result of that, there are a lot of things they could have done that have become common in a lot of other MMORPGs that they aren't. Like, they aren't doing things like charging an extra premium to be able to access Earthen, for example, which is something that a lot of other MMOs, you would just expect that. You would expect, especially free-to-play MMOs these days, you would expect, oh, there's a new thing. Well, I'm going to have to spend extra money for each individual segment of that thing. I don't just buy an expansion and get all of it. I buy an expansion, and then there's the premium pass that includes the actual, like, imagine if the Epic Edition of the game was the only way to get access to Earthen for like 2 months or something like that. That's the sort of thing that could have been done and has been done in other MMOs. These are mostly, like I say, either free-to-play MMOs or a lot of Eastern MMOs do stuff like this. It's actually very common in the Eastern market for stuff like this. At least last that I really looked into. I don't play a lot of Eastern MMOs these days, but anyway, I'm rambling again. There are things along those lines that could have been done, and I am confident that probably someone who has business in their title somewhere at Blizzard, almost certainly not anyone from the design team, would be thinking about this sort of thing. But this is the sort of stuff that someone at Blizzard or Activision or now Microsoft somewhere thought about at some point and may have even brought up, and instead they decided, you know what, let's just do like a 3-day early access instead. Now, that's not to say that we could never end up in that place in the future. I don't like slippery slope arguments as a general rule. I'd rather always look at what is the issue, the positive and negative of the thing that's right now. And I don't like the concept of, well, if we let them do this, then later on they might do this horrible thing instead, because people got to draw lines, and there's a point where the line becomes crossed. That's just the way that my brain thinks about stuff. I don't generally like the concept of a slippery slope argument where someone might say, well, if we let them do the early access, then maybe later on they will charge for individual races or something like that. It's entirely possible that they will or they won't. I don't think the fact that we allowed them to create this early access environment has any real factor on that whatsoever. Nikki has a lot of opinions about this right now, by the way. But again, just to be very, very clear, that is some hefty copium of the, like, this is not the worst thing Blizzard could have done to make more money. I'm glad that they aren't doing worse things, obviously, but it takes a lot to try and spin that as a positive. Wow, Nikki, you have so many thoughts right now. I actually don't know how much my microphone is picking up, but my cat has very many opinions on this particular. She is also telling me to stop with all the copium right now. Now, overall, going back to the question of, is this good for the game or ultimately bad for the game? To me, the whole splitting up friends thing, the whole, like, well, you came in later than us, so now you've got to catch up thing. To me, that is enough on its own to call the inclusion of early access into the War Within a net negative. To me, it's not great overall. Now, I want to be clear, to me personally, it kind of doesn't matter. Like, I'm basically going into this expansion with, like, we'll have some community members and stuff that are around, and that's cool. But I'm also coming into it from the perspective of a streamer, where having the early access means that I'm likely to get higher viewership than I would have otherwise, because there's going to be people who are not playing yet, but still want to watch and see what's going on. So from a streamer's perspective, this is great. Love that. Yeah. Extra viewership. Maybe some of them will actually subscribe or something. I don't know. But from an overall looking at the gameplay and the experience, and the, what's the word I'm looking for? The impact to the way that the game is played, I think I have to call this one ultimately a net negative for World of Warcraft. But I am very curious what all of your thoughts are. So please do leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. Also, we don't have any questions to get into this week, and that makes me sad because I love answering questions. So if you have any questions that you would like me to talk about here on the show, maybe related to something that I just talked about or related to anything else, anything in the gaming industry whatsoever. If you've got a thought in your head and you're thinking to yourself, I wonder what Devilor thinks of that. First of all, my condolences. But secondly, good news, you can find out. Just leave a comment here on YouTube, or if you are a patron, you can leave a comment either directly on the posting on Patreon, or there is a form that you can fill out that will be linked inside that posting that'll allow you to do some things like, mention exactly what name you want me to use on the show and so on. So if you're a patron, you can check that out over there. Patrons also do get priority on having their questions answered on the show. So if there's ever a case where I need to pick and choose, the Patreon questions always come first. Yeah, those were some sounds that I just made. I don't know what's going on right now. If you love, again, talking about Patreon, if you love the concept of early access and wish that you had more things with early access in your life, as I sit here and silently explode, hopefully silently, hope the microphone didn't pick half of that up. There was a thought there and it is gone. We've reached this part of the video where, wow. Oh, right. Early access. Patrons do get early access to every episode. Basically, as soon as I'm finished editing and putting it together, it goes straight up on Patreon right away. Sometimes that can be 2 days in advance. Sometimes that's a day in advance. Sometimes that's a few hours in advance. It really just depends on how well I'm able to do my job of getting everything together. And I am not a great video editor. I'm not super skilled at it. I'm very slow, and it's something that I don't like doing. It's the worst part of making videos. So sometimes it takes me longer than other times to get it together, but still, that is one of the perks that's available on Patreon. You also will have the perk of being able to not look at my face while you are enjoying this episode, because patrons do have access to the audio only versions of each episode. So if you want to just listen along, it's also available through Spotify. As long as you have your Spotify linked to your Patreon account, you can check that out. It's a good way to, while you're getting your steps in or whatever, listen to some idiot ramble about early access. Anyway, I'm going to call it there. Thanks again so much, everyone, for watching. I will see you next time.